Chapter 2. Prisoners in Space. I was standing in a cylinder of metal, and it was so hot I could feel the sweat dripping off my forehead and running down my face. It was absolutely black, but somewhere above me a circular metal door was being opened. I saw a tiny pinpoint of light and the vague shape of a person climbing down towards me. Somehow or other I knew the person was nervous. "Don't drop the light," I shouted. "Whatever you do, don't let go of it." I saw the light slip out of the person's hand and it plunged towards me. It got larger and larger until it filled the whole of the cylinder above me. It was a blinding light that hurt the back of my eyes, and I knew it was going to smash into my skull. I woke up, and the light was the soft light of a room. The sweat became little drops of water escaping from a cloth that was pressed against my forehead. The girl called Susan was sitting on the bed beside me, smiling with relief. "I knew you'd be all right. Barbara was very worried about you." Barbara, the girl in the fog, the old man. Memory flooded back, and at the same time I felt a throbbing pain on the left side of my forehead. The girl squeezed out the cloth and laid it across my forehead. "My name's Susan. We might as well get to know each other since we're to be together." "Are you my guard?" "You're free to come and go as you please inside TARDIS," she replied seriously. "Thanks very much. What's TARDIS?" Susan waved her hand above vaguely. I made up the name from the initials. She changed the cloth over my head, waiting for me to ask her what initials, but I didn't. She told me anyway. I knew she was going to. Time and relative dimensions in space. She began to take off the cap of a small orange-coloured tube. She squeezed a little of the contents, a thick brown paste, onto her index finger and rubbed it onto the sore place on my head. "This stings a little, but it'll get rid of the bump in half an hour." It stung more than a little, and I could feel my eyes watering, but at least the throbbing stopped. I was determined to be as nonchalant as I could until I was absolutely sure I was awake. I looked around me. The room was small, but the walls were identical to the other one I'd seen when I'd run through the doors, with raised circles on the walls and no evidence of lighting, although it was as clear as day. The bed I was on had a soft foam rubber mattress and was shaped rather like a deck chair, except that it was bent and raised under my knees. I looked at the girl again and found she was watching me. "Grandfather will explain everything to you," she said. "I'd better tell him you're awake." She got up and moved to the doorway, and the glass door slid open onto the wall as she approached. I put my hands together and gripped them as hard as I could, because it had been a police telephone box I'd run into, and I didn't like what was happening. She turned and looked back at me. "I hope you didn't get that job what you were after with Donaby's." I just stared at her for a moment or so, and then shook my head. She looked genuinely relieved, as if I cleared her conscience about something, and went out. I took the cloth from my head and used it to dab the tears in my eyes. The ointment had begun to stop stinging now, but I was suddenly aware of a tiredness in all my muscles. I also realised that I wasn't wearing my overcoat or the jacket of my suit, and somebody had taken my shoes off. I tried to get off the bed, but my body didn't want to move. I sank back, thinking I'd have another try in a few seconds. The old man came into the room, followed by Susan and the girl she'd called Barbara, who looked very pale but completely under control. She came straight over to me and sat on the bed and took one of my hands. "How are you now?" "A bit weak. What's happening here?" Her eyes looked away, as if she had something to be guilty about. I saw Susan open two of the circles in the wall and take out 3 stools. The old man sat on one and Susan the other, but Barbara stayed where she was. doctor will tell you everything, she said. I turned my eyes and met his. Without his cape or fur hat, he still clung to the costume of another age. A tapered black jacket, the edges bound with black silk and the trousers Edwardian, narrow and patterned in black and white check. He was even wearing spats and a cravat with a plain pearl tie-pin. His long silver hair and the pince-nez hanging around his neck by a piece of thin satin tape completed the picture. He had every right to wear eccentric clothes if he liked, I thought, but it simply didn't fit with the ultra-modern surroundings. He fitted the glasses firmly on his nose and pulled out a wallet and some of the papers from his pocket. I was determined not to speak until he did, even though he had taken them from my jacket without asking. I wasn't confident enough of my muscles yet. Ian Chesterton. He darted a look at me over the top of his glasses and then started sorting through the papers and letters. You're a schoolmaster with a degree in science. You don't like being a teacher much, I gather. Well, I suppose that shows ambition, although a certain lack of early purpose. He sniffed, as if he didn't approve of the way I was running my life. I couldn't feel any fury or anger, yet I wasn't indifferent either. Suddenly, he smiled at me. There are some men of 60 who smile and merely appear to be genial elderly men. And there are others who become younger. If I was right in my guess of his age, the smile made him shed about 20 years. I was surprised how much better I felt when he was friendly and realised that it quietened the awful anxiety and the suspicions about my sanity. You can't experience too many things outside normal explanation without thinking you're either dreaming or insane. Chesterton, you have certain qualities I admire, he said cheerfully. Perhaps my hasty decision will prove to be a blessing. For one thing, you do not ask a lot of stupid, ridiculous questions. You're content to wait until you hear the facts. It is also extremely fortunate that you're a student of science, because it suggests a rational mind. Have you any idea where you are? No idea at all, and I'd rather you didn't praise me about my lack of curiosity yet. I have rather a lot of questions. He waved his hand airily. Well, that's natural enough, young man. I must take you slowly, though, step by step. He crossed his legs and tapped his glasses on his chin for a moment. Let me put to you a hypothetical situation. Let us say you are a spy in a foreign country. You have a secret hiding place where you keep all sorts of things that are dangerous for even the most ordinary people to know about. One day your hiding place is discovered, quite by accident, by an unsuspecting member of the public. What do you do? I felt Barbara's hand tighten on mine for a second. Be patient, she said quietly. Oh, it's all right. This is all leading somewhere. I can see that. I turned back to the doctor, as she had called him. I'd have to give up the hiding place, because she'd be afraid of publicity. I agreed. Of course, if your hiding place was an aeronautical machine, aeroplane, grandfather, interrupted Susan. And he looked at her sharply, getting the silent apology he demanded. The old man turned his attention back to me again. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, your hiding place is an aeroplane. It is discovered. And now what do you do? Destroy it. And lose your escape route? Surely not. Wouldn't you fly it away? I agreed patiently that I would, if it were possible. Good. We made progress. Now these people, innocent members of the public who have stumbled across your hiding place. I knew the answer to that one because the analogy was childishly simple, even if the reasons behind it were not. I might have to take them with me, I said slowly. The doctor rubbed his hands together. Excellent, Chesterton. These innocent passers-by might spread the news abroad of your presence, mightn't they? Yes, you might have to decide to take them with you, however inconvenient it might be to you. Barbara said, or to them. After the silence, I said, so the sum total of all that is to tell me that you have some sort of flying machine or aeroplane and you've taken us with you. He nodded vigorously. You've grasped the essentials, Chesterton. Of course, my granddaughter and I are not spies, as you may well imagine. Of course not. I thought I might as well let this go on as long as possible until I felt stronger. However, we do have the strongest possible reason for not wishing anyone in your world to know of our existence. In my world. He looked at Susan briefly. Now we get to the biggest lie of all, I thought. Here it comes. My granddaughter and I are from another world. You and your companion are at present inside my ship, the TARDIS, which is able to cross the barriers of the fourth and fifth dimensions, time and space. I didn't say a word. Barbara's hand held under mine as if she were petrified of the old man, and I didn't blame her. It wasn't funny to be so close to a raving lunatic. After the pause, he went on. The young lady next to you, who I can introduce to you as Miss Barbara Wright, was engaged by me as a special tutor for Susan. I wanted Susan to become as well versed as possible with the culture and manners of England in the 20th century. Furthermore, Susan professed a curious preference for the liberties extended to young people of this day and age. The doctor stood up slowly and looked down at me, fingering his glasses thoughtfully. We're wanderers, Chesterton, Susan and I, cut off from our own planet and separated from it by a million years of your time. He really believes all this, I told myself. There was a genuine sadness in his eyes as he looked away from me. There'll come a day when we return. Susan got up from her stool and put her arms around him. They mean all this, I told myself. They aren't acting it, they're really serious. One day we will, Grandfather. He patted her head affectionately, then stepped away and looked at Barbara and me. You blundered into my ship, and I had to decide what to do quickly. I did everything I could to persuade him to let you both go, said Susan, and I felt the girl beside me catch her breath slightly. Don't tell me she believes what they're saying, I thought. The doctor was speaking again. But I decided against it. I have operated the TARDIS and we have left Earth. There is just one more thing I would say at this time. I raised my eyebrows deliberately. Oh, only one. The doctor stared at me for a moment. Even on your planet you have a rule, I believe, that says there can only be one captain to a ship. As Susan has told you, I have no doubt you are at liberty to come and go as you please within the TARDIS, but you must follow my orders without question at all times. My body was still weak, but I felt like testing it, so I swung my legs off the bed and stood up with Barbara beside me. Maybe I looked rocky because I felt her hand under my arm. I was glad of it because I found my legs were about as reliable as a rubber band's. I said, now I'll tell you what I think. It was that blinding light that fooled me when I ran through your doors. I suppose there was some sort of trap door there and we both fell through it. This is some cellar or underground cave that you've discovered and you've dressed it up with all sorts of gadgets to fit your story. I had to sit down again. It wasn't any good fooling myself. What surprised me more than anything was that the girl beside me was shaking her head slowly at me. You're wrong, her eyes were saying. I supported myself on the bed as best I could and ignored her. I want you to ring for a taxi to take us both home. I can't drive like this. A sudden thought occurred to me, and I looked at the old man in alarm. You have warned the police about all that wreckage on the road, haven't you? Chesterton, you must believe me. Forget about your planet. We're already in the next universe but one. He turned on his heel and walked out. Susan started to follow him and then looked back as she reached the doorway. It's all true, Mr. Chesterton. Every word of it. It's a lot of ridiculous nonsense, I said angrily. At last, I felt anger rushing through me. Susan glanced at Barbara desperately. Tell him, make him understand. It mustn't be too great a shock. She turned and followed her grandfather, and the glass door slid into place behind her. Barbara walked away slightly and sat down on one of the stools, her head turned away from me. I said, I'll be all right if you can give me 5 minutes. Then we'll get out of this madhouse. I'm afraid we won't. Wouldn't you like me to take you out to dinner somewhere? I think we both deserve it. She still turned away from me, silent and uncommunicative. I put a hand up to my forehead and the bump had completely gone. Whatever the ointment was that the girl had smeared on, it was certainly very quick. I tested my legs again and felt stronger. I stood up and there wasn't any dizziness anymore. I tried a few steps, keeping near the bed just in case, but I didn't have any more trouble. Suddenly, I found that Barbara was watching me. I crossed over to her and sat down on the stool next to her. For some reason or another, you believe the old man, don't you? There isn't any reason behind this, she said slowly. This is something that's happened beyond our powers of reason. We just have to accept it. I don't have to accept anything. What's he done to you, for heaven's sake? Listen, the girl's all right. Let's get out of this asylum and leave them to their own fantasies. It's only about 100 yards down the road to my car. I can run you home. She shook her head slowly and turned her head away from me again. The old man has really convinced her, I thought. She got up from the stool and walked over to the glass door and looked through it. I noticed that it didn't slide open this time. I'd like to tell you how this all started. For me. She turned and looked at me inquiringly. All right, if it will tell me why you automatically believe everything the old man tells you. She leaned against the glass door. I put an advertisement in one of the papers about 4 months ago. Extra cramming in special subjects, personal tuition, prefer history or geography, but will generalise. You know the sort of thing. I was fed up being a secretary in an office, and those were the subjects I knew well. I thought it might be the beginning of bigger things. I rather fancied the idea of running a school all of my own, and I've done quite a lot of teaching anyway. Relief work and that sort of thing. She smiled briefly. I only had one reply, asking me to ring a certain telephone number. I did and spoke to Susan. She told me her name was Susan English and that her grandfather, a doctor, wanted her to have a course of special studies in history from 10 until 4 every day except Saturdays and Sundays. I asked if I could meet her grandfather and discuss the eventual object of the classes. Was she to try for one of the universities? Why wasn't she going to a finishing school? How much was I to be paid, and so on? Susan told me I couldn't meet her grandfather because he was very busy on research, but that the object was to have a working knowledge of general English history, and that I was to be paid £20 a week. I stared at her. I don't wonder you took her on. Well, it wasn't only the money, although that was marvellous. I think I told Susan every week it was too much, but she just laughed about it and said her grandfather was very rich. What about her previous schooling? Yes, I asked her about that. She just said she'd been travelling. In fact, she was pretty vague about every question I asked her. Surely in 4 months you must have found out something definite, I argued. Once in a while she'd let something slip out. She hadn't seen her mother and father for a long time. She'd never been to England before, little things like that. It never got anywhere because she simply turned the conversation away whenever I tried to follow something up. She moved away from the glass door and sat opposite to me on one of the stools. It was in the history itself where I learned most about her. She once wrote me a 30-page essay on Robespierre, which even went into details about what walks he took and the measurements of some of his clothes. On the other hand, she made the most terrible mistakes. Such as, she thought Australia was in the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, 101 things. She thought the Spanish Armada was a castle. Some of them were so wrong they were laughable. And it wasn't a lack of attention or carelessness. She was really upset when she made a mistake. She started crying once when I was cross with her because she had written that Japan was a country in Scotland. I burst out laughing, but Barbara didn't seem to share my amusement. I know it seems funny, but look at it in another way, it's a little frightening, don't you think? I shrugged. Anyway, she went on, I was determined to have a chat with this grandfather of hers. The last 2 or 3 weeks had been a succession of evasions and excuses. Then tonight there was fog, and I insisted on driving her home. I practically forced her. There was silence for a moment or two while I considered everything she'd told me. I had to admit there were some strange things to explain away. None of it made me change my opinion that the old man was either very eccentric or a lunatic. I wasn't feeling too happy about the young girl called Susan either. I was just coming round to the belief that some straight talking was in order when the glass door slid open and Susan looked in. Grandfather says you can come out now. We'll be arriving soon. And will it still be foggy on Barnes Common? She didn't smile. I had the uncanny feeling she thought I was the one who was insane. It's very kind of your grandfather to tell us when to come or go, I said coldly. You might tell him we certainly are coming out, and furthermore, I stood up and heard the anger sharpening my words. You can tell him I want those doors open and no more arguments. Susan turned and went out of the room again without saying a word, and I turned to Barbara. You've told me a story that had some odd things about it. The whole evening has been peculiar. It's made you believe one thing, and it's made me sure of another. Let's go and find out who's right and who's wrong. She nodded briefly and walked into the other room. I followed her, and we walked through a short corridor that was made up entirely of tall, square pillars of coloured glass. The reds, blues and yellows alternately glowing and dying down. I thought about the old man's electricity bill and had to admit he'd gone to a lot of trouble and expense to bolster up his absurd story of travelling from another world. Then we turned into the first room I'd seen, the control room as the doctor called it, and I saw him standing over the central panel, his hands darting from switch to lever to button, pressing some and turning off others. I began to feel a faint shivering in the floor beneath me, and the lowering decibels of an engine whine sounded in my ears. The doctor looked up and beckoned us over to where he was standing. Stand near me, he commanded, and look up at the scanner screen. Never mind about any of that, I said sharply. Open the doors and let us out. He leaned on the panel and looked at me seriously. You disappoint me. I had the mistaken idea that you were intelligent, or at least you had some imagination. The shuddering started to increase in the floor, and I could feel it tingling up through the bones of my legs. I don't know what you think you're doing, but if you don't open the doors, I'll kick them down, I shouted. It wasn't anger or fear that made me shout at him. The engine noise was now filling the control room. It was rather like a dozen of those wartime sirens, all running down and not quite together. You won't have to do any kicking, he said, quite mildly, I thought. I will open the doors in a moment, and then you'll see for yourself. He glanced at Susan. So dogmatic, my dear. They can't accept anything they can't explain. She believes as grandfather. I looked at Barbara. She was staring up at the place the old man has told us both to watch, the scanner screen. I looked too. There was a kind of mist, rather like the fog on the picture, and I was sure we were looking out onto Barnes Common for a moment. Suddenly, the floor gave a final shudder which made all of us stagger, and Barbara clutched hold of my arm for support. The whine of the engine stopped suddenly, and in dead silence I saw the screen clear. I felt the first real doubt since I'd run through the doors of the police box. I was looking at an extraordinary forest of white-looking trees. The picture altered and gave a closer view of one of the trees. There were no leaves, and it had a dead look about it. Not particularly inspiring, murmured the doctor, but not very dangerous either. Where are we? Asked Barbara. The doctor shrugged. Very difficult to say. I do have what Susan is pleased to call a yearometer. Unfortunately, on a previous expedition it was slightly damaged. I really must get around to seeing if I can't mend it. But we're not in England anymore. The old man looked at her in surprise. I thought I'd made that quite clear, Miss Wright. We have not only left England, but we've left Earth. I shall have to sample the atmosphere outside and do various other little tests, but we'll know more in a few moments. The temperature seems quite good, Susan said. I took 3 short steps and swung the doctor round. Now listen, you. I'm fed up with all this game playing. If you don't open those doors, I swear to you I'll smash them down. He knocked my hands away sharply, and it crossed my mind that he was surprisingly powerful for a man of his age and build. He stepped back and suddenly pointed a finger at me, his eyes gleaming with fury. You invaded my ship. I didn't ask you in here. You assaulted me and forced your way in. He dropped his hand, and some of the fury died away in his eyes, to be replaced by a superciliousness that didn't do my temper any good at all. All that stupid, ridiculous mystery out on the road, I stormed. Why didn't you tell us you were Susan's grandfather? Why lie about the key? Why run away? Of course we were all worried because we didn't know who you were, and Susan was missing. So don't start accusing people of forcing their way into your home when you know perfectly well there was an excellent reason to do so. Yes, well, that's all fairly logical as far as it goes. Concern and curiosity are valid feelings, but scepticism, my dear Chesterton, and he was so superior I felt like kicking him. Yes, scepticism is a failing in your world. Then open the doors and let us take our feelings as far away from you as possible. There was a short pause, and then the doctor turned his head and looked at Barbara. I believe you have more of an open mind on the subject, Miss Wright. It doesn't make sense to me, she said, but yes, I believe you. I looked at her in astonishment. How can you accept any of it? Time and space travelling, people from another world, it's all absolute nonsense. The doctor gave a short, harsh little laugh and walked up to me and tapped me on the chest with his forefinger. I imagine this is the treatment Columbus received when he propounded his theory of your planet being circular. For a space traveller, he seemed remarkably well informed about the history of Earth. I have read a little, he admitted, but I much prefer to experience history. The younger Columbus was a man of such obvious promise that I always regretted leaving him before he made his theories known. I looked at Barbara helplessly. You can't believe this, man. You simply can't. At the very least, he's an eccentric. The doctor brushed past me rudely. Open the door, Susan, he ordered. That's the only way to make this young fool realise. But we haven't checked everything properly yet, Grandfather. I don't care about that. I simply won't stand here and be subjected to insult from a young man whose intellect can't even stretch out to accept known and proved scientific fact. Open the doors. Susan turned a little black switch. The lights glowed all around us again, and there was the sound of that buzzing noise I'd heard before, rather like a swarm of angry bees. The two great double doors began to swing open. The doctor marched towards them and looked back as he paused before going out. You wanted to go out. Come along. I moved after him slowly, only just conscious that Barbara was walking beside me. The trouble was that I could see past the doctor quite clearly, and what I was looking at was what I had seen on the scanner screen. White, dead-looking trees, a kind of ashy soil, a cloudless sky. The heat fanned my face as I stopped at the doorway of the ship. I heard Barbara make a small sound in her throat beside me. Somebody touched me on the arm and handed me my shoes, which I put on, only half aware that other hands were tying their laces. I heard Susan's voice telling me I ought not to walk about in stockinged feet, because there was no telling what the ground would be like. I didn't do any of the conventional things that one reads about, like pinching myself or rubbing my eyes. I just stood there and stared about me, a dead horror of total realization creeping through my body. He had been telling the truth. Every word made sense to me because there wasn't any other way of explaining it. I wanted to run away, to hide, to scream out in absolute fear. But where could I go? What was the point of being afraid? I almost felt rather than saw the doctor standing in front of me, and the kindness in his eyes helped me back to a sort of reality. Chesterton, he said gently, this is the hardest part of all for you. I know exactly what you're going through, and it's no triumph for me to be right. I have transported us all away from your world and your universe, and we have landed on a new planet. Accept that, because you must. Tears and anger will not take you back to Earth, so learn from this new experience and profit by it. I nodded dumbly, and he patted my arm pleasantly enough. That's right, Chesterton. You'll soon get used to it. He looked at Barbara. You're extraordinarily cool, my dear, but I sense the sadness about you. As I have just said to your companion, try to rise above what has happened to you. At first it may be horrifying to you to be wrenched away from what you know and love and trust. I understand that. But isn't there an enormous excitement in doing what none of your people has ever believed possible? It's not a form of mental torture, but a privilege to step out onto a new soil and see an alien sun wheeling above you in another sky. He stepped back, regarded us both with a slight smile, then turned and moved towards the nearest tree. Barbara and I stepped out of the ship, and Susan came behind us and closed the doors. Then she ran over to her grandfather, and I heard her thanking him for being so nice to us. I turned my head and looked at Barbara. Her face was white, but there wasn't a tear anywhere on her face or in her eyes, and I thought her composure was one of the most admirable things I'd ever known. I thought of the rotten interview I'd had at Donnaby's and my subsequent depression at failing to get a job I wanted so much. I thought of a ruined supper at my digs, the fog on the common, and tearing my best sports jacket in the morning. I suppose the triviality of that last memory made me smile slightly, and I suddenly realised that Barbara was smiling back at me. She said, "We'd better keep up with the doctor." I nodded, and we started to walk over to him. The world, my world and my life on it seemed already to be moving into the distance. I glanced over my shoulder and looked at the doctor's ship. Outwardly, just as it had been on somewhat common. It appeared to be a police telephone box, but I knew without any doubt at all that inside it the dimensions were different. Around me was a world that was new to me and might well be totally different from anything I had ever come up against before. I didn't know whether I hated it or disliked it or what I felt yet. I only knew that the doctor was right and that I had to accept it. Either that or go completely insane. Insanity would imply that everything around me was a strange setting of the mind, that I was hypnotized, or drugs. Dreams and nightmares I knew only too well never sustained belief for very long, and the more time I took to examine my surroundings and match them against my actions and sensations, the weaker the idea of fantasy became. I was certain I wasn't hypnotized. I was sure I had not been drugged, and I was positive I wasn't dreaming. I began to feel better. The doctor had told me the wisest thing to do would be to open my mind and accept what had happened. I did.